So I want to get your reaction to what George Magnus said, but I'll put up a chart that illustrates how the economy has been slowing down in China overall and ask you, how does that affect President Xi's stature, both within China and within the region?
You know, I think that President Xi has built up support for a number of reasons. And while this can't help him, my guess is that he may be able to not only survive it, but even explain it away as partly the result of his anti-corruption efforts, partly the result of reorienting China towards a different kind of growth model, more based on consumption, partly based on weathering this trade flap or trade war with the United States, which, of course, was a long time in the coming and was decided upon more by President Trump than by President Xi, so I'm not sure how much blame the latter will get. In other words, it can't be good. And I'm sure that, like any country, in China, an incumbent leader is going to suffer as an economy suffers. But we also know that in autocratic regimes, often a narrative can be developed that explains away the slowdown in some broader context and emphasizes the accomplishments of the same leader. So, again, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth because I genuinely don't know and suspect, in fact, that it probably won't be a major hit on Xi, as long as it's sort of temporary and this new model of growth that many Chinese economists have favored really does begin to come into being and, you know, restore healthier growth rates in the years to come.
An interesting part of the narrative, as you describe it, came from the Prime Minister Li Keqiang as he gave this economic address today, because he said in some substance that a lot of their problems were really because of the trade dispute with the United States. Is that right? Is that what's causing it? Is President Trump really bringing that much pressure to bear? Or is this sort of like retailers blame the weather for not selling enough stuff? Is this sort of we got problems and we'll blame it on the U.S.?
Without wanting to claim too much expertise as an economist, not really my strong suit, I would simply say that the analyses that I've seen suggest that the GDP growth implications of the trade tariffs are in the sort of 0.5% range. So in a broader cosmic sense, no, it's not right to blame President Trump or the tariffs for the fact that China is now headed towards 6% growth. On the other hand, between 6 and 6.5%, that differential may be, in fact, largely explained by the recent trade difficulties. And so at a very tactical near-term level, there could be something to the argument.
So let's turn for a moment to that Hanoi summit, the second summit with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un that President Trump had, that didn't come out the way I think at least President Trump had hoped it would. Sticking on China for a moment, what role, if any, did China play in that, either a positive one or otherwise?
Well, most importantly, China has been imposing and largely sustaining the economic sanctions that the UN Security Council, with Beijing's obvious blessing as a veto-wielding member, had imposed in the last 2 or 3 years after China's nuclear and missile tests. And there's a lot of talk about how the sanctions have eroded. There's a little bit of truth to that, but a whole lot of exaggeration. What we see in the data is that North Korea's economy has suffered substantially and continues to suffer substantially from these sanctions. And it's primarily China that's been cutting off or reducing the trade, because China, as you know, was 90% of North Korean trade prior to these sanctions, and probably still is today with what's left of that trade. So I think we have to give China a lot of credit. Again, they could do better. They allow some evasion. It's not perfect. They are sort of impatient, just as South Korea is impatient to see the sanctions regime relaxed. But so far they have kept their word pretty much, and therefore given us the leverage, which we only could wield if, in fact, the entire regional economy of East Asia was pressuring North Korea, because there was no substantial U.S.-North Korea trade before any of this anyway. So the pressure from the sanctions is because other countries are complying with the sanctions, countries like China in particular. That's the most important thing, but it's a pretty darn important thing.
Michael, as you know so well, since shortly after the end of World War II, this has been perhaps the most opaque country in the world, North Korea, to know what's going on inside there. But given what you just said, might that give us some reason to believe that the President of the United States is actually in a stronger position to get North Korea to come toward him on the deal rather than him having to go to North Korea? Because clearly they had two different deals. They couldn't bridge the gap.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I tend to agree with you, although I'm not going to predict that a deal will be struck. It's obviously in Kim Jong-un's mind and hands now to decide if he wants to offer a better and what I would call a more reasonable deal than the very bad bargain he offered up in Hanoi, and that his negotiators had been talking about with U.S. negotiators prior to the summit. So in that regard, yes, we have the stronger hand on the purely economic front. But of course, Kim Jong-un keeps building more nuclear weapons with every passing month. So I don't want to go too far in arguing that time is unambiguously on our side. It's a little bit of a mixed situation. But we should not, I don't think, argue that time is fundamentally on Kim Jong-un's side. I don't think that he can see a way out of his economic predicament unless sanctions are relaxed. Now, it's true that North Korea's economy has partly privatized, partly become more flexible in recent years. There have been some good recent studies that have shown the price of rice and gasoline and other basic necessities has not gone up that much in the last couple of years, even as sanctions have been imposed. But any North Korean hopes to follow the Vietnam model or the China model and really attract substantial external investment and enter the global economy in a more meaningful way, I don't think those can be realized under current conditions.
Michael, finally, to change our direction over to the Middle East, we would call it, some people call it West Asia, Saudi Arabia. There's a move afoot right now up in the United States Senate, bipartisan, I must say. We have Marco Rubio as well as Bob Menendez, really to impose sanctions on Saudi Arabia for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Is this likely to result in a substantive change in our relationships with Saudi Arabia, or is it more for show?
Well, I think it's more for show, but I don't want to denigrate it either. I think we have to send some strong messages and maybe put just a wee bit of the fear of God or fear of Allah, so to speak, into Saudi minds, because they're used to being able to weather these kinds of disruptions in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, most notably after 9/11, when 15 of the 19 hijackers, of course, were Saudi citizens. And we managed to get over that. And the Saudis could be very cynical, perhaps, in interpreting that as because the Western world depends on Saudi oil so much. Actually, the whole global economy depends so much on Saudi oil. There's no way we're going to sustain our anger very long. I would rather the Saudis have to worry a little bit that we can find some measures that are more than symbolic. They may not fundamentally dissolve the U.S.-Saudi strategic or economic relationship. I don't think that's realistic, and neither is it necessary or appropriate. But we can do things that make them hurt a little bit and that make them worry a little bit. And I applaud the senators for attempting that.